In the original Castle Wolfenstein, developed by Silas S. Warner and released in 1981 by Muse Software, you play as an Allied soldier captured by Nazis in World War II and taken to a castle for interrogation. There, a dying compatriot hands you a pistol and 10 bullets he managed to get smuggled in as his last act. Gun in hand, you have one job: get the Nazi war plans and escape the castle alive. Looked at from 2020, Castle Wolfenstein is an odd beast. For one, it's such an early game that the controls are wildly different than what you might expect looking at the gameplay. There's a circle of keys to press to walk in 8 cardinal directions, and you tap them to start walking in that direction, then tap the center key to stop walking. That's right, walking is an 8-directional modal input here. Then there's another circle of keys for aiming in 8 directions separate from the direction you're walking, allowing for a sort of proto-twin-stick shooter action, where you can walk past a hallway but keep your gun drawn in that direction just in case. Castle Wolfenstein is also an early stealth game where enemy soldiers don't react until you enter their line of sight, they hear a gunfire, or an alarm is pulled. There are stealth-like mechanics where unlocking chests takes time, putting pressure on players as a Nazi may walk around a corner and find you before it's opened. And you can even dress up in their outfits if you manage to find one in order to help you blend in. It's also what we might today call a roguelite. A random castle is procedurally generated each time you play, and after you die, you can continue to play the same castle with killed enemies removed from the game until you manage to beat it, or you can generate a new castle if the current one isn't to your liking. And that's basically the game, sneaking by or shooting Nazis, scrounging for bullets, and desperately looking for a way out, or whatever can just help you get past the next room. The end result is something that, by modern standards, is almost impossible to play due to its jank and clunkiness. Its ideas are awesome, but pretty clearly exceed its grasp and the restrictions of the technology at the time. But those ideas themselves are really cool? Frankly, Castle Wolfenstein feels like it could be pitched right now. Does a World War II stealth roguelike shooter that's like Enter the Gungeon meets Metal Gear Solid not sound like something that could easily end up on Steam these days? So it's easy to see why the game, clunky or not, was a favorite of PC game players of the era, including the developers at id Software. By the end of 1991, id had wrapped up the Commander Keen trilogy, and had handed off stewardship of Catacomb 3D to Softdisk, who would continue making sequels to the game through 1994. Their current obligations met, their next project could be just about anything they wanted, and what they wanted was to bring Silas Warner's then decade-old 2D vision into the third dimension. And thus was born Wolfenstein 3D, a game that ends up being a pretty loose adaptation of Warner's top-down stealth roguelike, all told. Gone are the procedurally generated castles. Wolfenstein 3D is very much a static series of developer-designed levels. The stealth element is kind of there, but barely. You can get the drop on soldiers if they're looking away, but as soon as you open fire, all enemies in a room become aware of you. I don't think anyone would argue that Wolfenstein 3D is a stealth game in the way that Castle Wolfenstein is a stealth game. No, the real lasting touch of Silas Warner's game to id Software's early efforts was to make resources matter. The adaptation of Catacomb to 3D was an adaptation of a gauntlet-style action game. You were spamming attack constantly with no real ammo to speak of, and you were swimming in RPG-style inventories of health and magic spells. Unless you really got into a bind, or you were fighting a boss, you never found yourself wanting for resources. Catacomb 3D was more about exploration and understanding what the levels were asking of you. Combat was sort of just a thing you did along the way. And as long as you had a single potion, a full health bar was just a button click away. In contrast, Castle Wolfenstein was a game about scraping by, about grabbing just 3 bullets off a guard you barely managed to kill, about improvising in a pinch to see if you could sneak past a guard rather than bother to engage them in combat because it was just too dangerous. And that, along with the general premise of a World War II prisoner escaping a castle full of Nazis, is what id managed to properly adapt here. Your weapons now have ammo, and it's a surprisingly scarce resource if you're not careful. Enemies drop only 4 bullets at a time, and your guns, from the pistol to the minigun, all pull from the same pool. And you can no longer carry health packs with you like you could in Catacomb 3D, you use them as soon as you touch them. This had the effect of giving Wolfenstein 3D a much more dynamic gameplay loop than Catacomb 3D. In that game you were fine until you were completely dead because you ran out of potions. In Wolfenstein 3D, your situation ebbed and flowed. An enemy who got the jump on you could really knock down your health and put you in a dangerous position for a while, or carelessly spraying too many bullets could leave you resource constrained for the next encounter. Similarly, a secret room full of ammo or a dungeon full of health packs at the right moment could make you feel invincible with a wealth of resources to fall back on. This gives something of a John McClane vibe to BJ Blazkowicz's Escape. It's a one-man guerrilla fight against some German guys where everything is improvised and desperate and victory is by the skin of his teeth, but occasionally... Now I have a machine gun. Ho ho ho. Now, I don't want to oversell this. It's entirely likely that the genre would have arrived at these mechanics one way or another, and id Software are not the guys who invented health pickups or ammo as a resource. I mean, they were adapting a game that had that stuff from 1981, and tabletop games had similar systems since before computer games were even really a thing. But I want to sort of stress how this changed not only the way that id approached the design of their first-person titles going forward, but all the games that would copy their formula for years afterwards. The decision to have insta-use health and constrained ammunition placed around the game world took away item use agency from the player and put it in the hands of developers. When you got health was no longer up to you, but up to the level designers. They controlled the waxing and waning of your ammunition based on what sorts of enemies they threw at you and how much ammo they stashed around. Those decisions, whether they were made to better replicate the resource-strapped adventure envisioned by Silas Warner, or because they made for a higher-stakes, faster-paced action shooter that doesn't get slogged down by inventory management, ended up putting further emphasis on level designers, as they were responsible not just for the areas you fought in, but the general tone and pace of minute-to-minute gameplay too. And again, maybe the first-person shooter genre would have gotten there on its own, and maybe it's just a naturally level-design-focused genre and this sort of thing was inevitable. But it is cool to see it taking form between Catacomb's high-concept level tricks and Wolfenstein's refocus towards lower-level gameplay cycles. And this may be skipping ahead too much, but it's interesting to see how a contemporary id Software has reversed this trend. Modern Doom has health packs and ammo pickups, sure, but really when you get health and armor and ammo is entirely up to the players. And it's a whole other video I could do, but it's interesting that one of my big complaints about Modern Doom is that while the core combat loop is really good, it's also really kinda samey, in part because there are fewer ways for level designers to construct different interactions. But health and ammo weren't the only changes to the formula that played up the importance of level designers. Where Catacomb 3D felt like an experiment in level design gimmicks with very little interest paid to enemies other than to just annoy players and give them something to do, Wolfenstein 3D feels like the opposite. The structure of the levels themselves is almost a return to Hovertank, labyrinthine corridors that all start blending together after a while. You will be sick to death of the same generic stone walls, 4 paintings of Hitler, and weirdly 70s-looking faux wood paneling by the end of the game. But the emphasis isn't on constructing memorable level-wide puzzles and set pieces like in Catacomb. Instead, the focus is on enemy encounters. Mein Leben! The game kind of treats individual rooms like Castle Wolfenstein's individual screens. You never know what awaits you on the other side of a door. Maybe it's a small room with one enemy and some health. Maybe it's a sprawling room with 3 or 4 enemies all spread out. Maybe it's the exit, or the key you need, or just another long empty hallway with more doors. You don't know. If Wolfenstein 3D's levels do have a playfulness, it's more room by room rather than level by level. And to make those room by room encounters all play differently, they toyed with different enemy designs. Like, sure, Catacomb 3D had different enemy types, but they were all more or less the same thing. Melee monsters that would run at you and then you had to shoot them before they touched you. Some had more health than others, but that was basically it outside of the end boss of the game. But Wolfenstein? It had generic soldiers that will shoot you with a pistol on sight, but it also has SS troops in blue that have more health and more dangerous weapons, as well as officers that move and draw their guns much more quickly than normal soldiers. There are German Shepherds, a melee-only enemy, which in some ways makes them easier to deal with, but that never drop ammo, which can make them a drain on resources. And there are even mutants, zombie-like monsters resulting from unethical Nazi experiments that fire from a gun surgically implanted in their chest that have no wind-up time before they fire, making it critical you get the first shots off. This variety of enemies with unique behaviors and threats changes how you have to engage with the game's combat. And by mixing and matching, or by changing the number of enemies encountered, level designers can put different pressures on you. Once you have a machine gun, one SS trooper isn't so difficult, but a room with 3 of them becomes a challenge. Hiding some of the quick-draw enemies around corners plays to their advantage and requires you to play even more cautiously. Having to clear a kennel of dogs to find a key might not be hard, but it can leave the player ammo-starved. And all of that factors back into giving level designers the power to place resources. Ultimately, what's shocking to me, coming back and really playing through Wolfenstein, is how well it holds up on its own. It's a well-known property thanks to Return to Castle Wolfenstein and more recently Machine Games' entries into the franchise. But before that, through most of the 90s, it was Doom's kid brother, a prototype that was just a stepping stone to greatness rather than something really good in its own right. Revisiting it now, it's clear that that's just not true. It's still engaging to play almost 30 years later, even if it is a little simplistic by modern standards. Wolfenstein 3D is also the first id game that feels like a modern id game tonally. That weird juxtaposition of a dark tone and gruesome imagery with sophomoric cartoon goofiness. It's a game about Nazis and Hitler and prisoners of war and scraping small amounts of ammo off a person you just barely managed to kill and being so desperate to survive you'll eat dog food. But it's also a game where, before confronting Mecha Hitler, you have to kill Vampire Hitlers. Which I like to read as a nod to Hitler's obsession with the occult, but canonically are supposed to be puppets hung from the ceiling with mock Hitler heads on them and a flamethrower in their chest to distract allies who get too close to Hitler's bunker. It is in some ways a profoundly goofy game. I mean, Hitler's death gets an instant replay.
Eva, auf Wiedersehen.
And not only are the funny parts still funny, but the 10-level episodes are deliciously bite-sized and each finishable in about a single evening. The level design itself may get repetitive, but the core combat loop of sneaking from room to room, not sure what's behind any given door, and trying to get the drop on enemies remains surprisingly enjoyable. But regardless of how I feel, I think Castle Wolfenstein and Wolfenstein 3D are worth looking back at, if only to see how a game way ahead of its time in 1981, with design ideas that still feel relevant in 2020, managed to nudge the first-person shooter design away from a flat, gauntlet-style spam fest, or an Ultima Underworld-style menu system, and towards a system where the ebb and flow of resources and the structure of combat leaned heavily on the will of the level designer. Elsewhere in 1992, there wasn't much going on yet in the world of first-person shooters. Ultima Underworld is the other real contender for the most important first-person title of the year, and while there's a strong case for it and it casts a long shadow, I'd figured I'd save it in case I ever covered immersive sims this way. Still, its proper influence wouldn't be felt for a while. Where Doom would spawn a million clones after 1993, Ultima Underworld would have a slow march of highly aspirational, highly beloved spiritual successors throughout the years. And I do think Ultima Underworld serves as an interesting comparison point, if only because so much of its design ethos is counter to what id were doing. Ultima Underworld is a story-heavy, slow-paced game set in a lived-in world that adds systems for player expression, where the developers step back, built problems, provided tools, and asks players to design a solution. The other big profile first-person shooter I could find that year was Robocop III by Digital Image Design and published by Ocean. It's got a surprisingly slick, clean look for a game from that era, with flat-shaded 3D level geometry mixed with 2D silhouette sprites. It was clearly a high-budget affair, including getting the likeness rights from some of the actors of the films. As such, it had some neat frills, like you could fly around on Robocop's jetpack or drive around a full 3D city in hot pursuit with some of the worst first-person driving I've ever seen. But ultimately, Robocop 3 was more of a shooting gallery, where your goal was to shoot bad guys and not shoot innocents in as clean and as fast a way as possible. Notably, it did not include ammo or even a traditional health mechanic, simply an effectiveness rating that went down when you shot innocent people or took damage. And there's an interesting question to ask, maybe, given that the three biggest first-person titles of 1992 were so different: was the genre not yet defined and codified, or had a single rubric simply not yet come to dominate it? If we didn't consolidate around one design, would we have had more variety and expressiveness in the first-person space, or would we simply have not had a genre at all? It's worth pondering because next time it's 1993, and there's really only one choice of game for that year for this series.